You're listening to On Mission with Dr. Matt Davis, a podcast designed to explore the personal mission of everyday leaders. Hear from men and women who are making a difference in their corner of the world and discover what keeps them on mission.
Welcome to On Mission with Dr. Matt Davis. I'm Jonathan Sheely. We are joined today by Tim McPhillips, Vice President for Institutional Advancement at Maranatha. Tim is a 2001 graduate who moved back to Watertown in November of 22. Tim and his wife Mandy have 5 children, 2 of which attend the academy. His first job was a dishwasher in the Maranatha kitchen. Tim's favorite meal is any smoked meat with mashed potatoes. He enjoys hiking and watching the Detroit Lions and the University of Michigan football team. Tim, welcome to the podcast, boss.
Thank you.
You're 1-1 with Jonathan.
Yeah, 1-1.
He's a smoked meat guy, but not a Michigan guy, I don't think by any stretch. And you are the VP for advancement and filling some big shoes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Yes, I am. And the more I interact with Dr. Harrison, the more how big I see those shoes are. So,
and Dr. Harrison was on the podcast last season, and we had a chance to talk to him about his life and his legacy. And at that time, we kind of knew you were on the way, but you hadn't started yet. And now it's a real joy to serve together. And we are no strangers. We went to Maranatha together as undergrads, and it's been awesome to see the Lord continue to use you in your life. We also have the common bond that we both served in the dishwasher ministry. I see.
It's a common theme for people's first job.
My job was called, more specifically, pot wash. So we like to specialize, and so in the dish room, there's the
is there a certification
pot
for that?
guys, and these days being a pot guy would be a different.
That's exactly where my head was.
All right, well, that's not what I meant.
We were very happy in the
pot
dish room.
wash. Yes.
We were enjoying.
And they told me the name of the job is also the training for the job. Pot wash. Just this self-explanatory. Do it, kid. And so that's what I did. And I don't know about you, but it was the kind of job that was motivational to get another job, right?
Yes, it was.
Work your way up and find something else.
Well, I took the job not because I wanted it. It was because I had to wait for my dad to pick me up from school, and he worked in Sun Prairie.
Okay.
I started in high school, and it's
Right.
like, he goes, you're not just going to sit around there. You find a job. And
Yeah.
so.
Now, you actually came to the academy here, but your parents were not on the faculty and staff, so
Nope.
that had to be a little bit unusual even just from that perspective.
I was a fish out of water when
really?
I came here.
What year would that have been in high school?
It would have been fall of 93, and I was an unbeliever and did not want to be here. I actually, when my dad got the job transfer and he told me, I was finding ways to run away from home to stay in Michigan and not move here. But my dad knew I was doing it, and so he called my 2 older brothers who were in the Army to come home and help him. And I remember the conversation with my brothers. Dad says if you come, he'll let you play football.
Oh.
Because I never was allowed to play football at the public school I was at because the coach there was not a stellar coach. And my dad just had a bad view of football coaches.
Yeah.
And so, but the academy, Maranatha had football, which means it's got to be okay.
Oh, well, there you go.
And so, ironically, tomorrow I'll go to the funeral of my first football
was
coach,
gonna
and
ask
Coach
you
Akins.
if
And
Coach Akins was your coach.
yes, he was. He made me love the game and realize that football could be played by believers, and football is a violent sport. But he made it such a fun sport, and not only
very
that,
safe if there are mothers out there.
Yeah.
It's very, very safe now.
Yes.
They've changed a lot.
a lot safer than when I played.
That was 30 years ago. I just want to remind you, that's 30 years ago.
Have you had a chance since Coach Akins' passing to formalize your thoughts a little bit or synthesize your how you think of his influence on your life?
His influence, yeah. It was hard to put into words, and but he was someone. Again, I was an unbeliever coming in to the team, and it was his consistent. He taught me you could have fun, and it could be clean fun. You could use humor, and it could be godly humor. It was always, and he was the master of the pun.
Oh yeah.
And so he would rattle them off in a huddle, and it would just be hilarious.
I think he was. I was just telling somebody else this morning. I think he was just the most funny guy I ever met. Just
Yes.
hilarious.
The first time I met him, I did not think he was the coach. I thought he was just an individual from the community helping, because you walked out on the field, and I had only been in town for 3 days. I knew no one who was going to be on the team. I just showed up. That was my first introduction to the academy, was showing up for this preseason.
Were you a big kid at that point? The kind of guy that they would have been happy to see join the football team?
Probably medium size.
Okay.
I had size, but no football IQ.
Okay.
So, I mean, I didn't even know how to put on my pads, and where does this pad go? What do you do with it? And I walked out. There was 2 coaches, Greg Winiger, who just looked like the SEC coach.
Yeah.
And then there's this guy with bib overalls and a Chicago Cubs bucket hat, just being goofy. And I'm like, Greg Winiger has to be the coach. And it was the other way around. And
he was not a pretentious guy by any stretch.
He was such a joy. And
yeah,
I mean, he was intense, but never lost his cool. And
really,
as a coach, I mean, he could be intense, but
yeah.
He loved the men that he coached.
I don't want to say he was not an unserious man.
Correct.
Which is a strange thing for someone who used humor so effortlessly and so universally. I mean, I didn't know anybody that didn't think he was hilarious,
Yes.
And he used to go on the road and recruit for Maranatha. And I remember in high school, he came to my high school with Peter Wright, who I think was a student even at the time. And it was just hilarious. He came walking out. How memorable does it have to be for a guy my age to be able to remember almost everything he said at a college promo in my Christian high school chapel? But he walks out there for Christian high school chapel, where all of us are, trying to dress as dumpy as possible. He comes out in graduation robes,
regalia,
gowns.
Are you serious?
All of his regalia. Yes. And I just told you he doesn't have a pretentious bone in his body, right? But he's wearing it like a costume, basically. And he's got the tassel literally down in front of his face, and he keeps blowing it out, and it keeps going up and down. And he says, "I'm here to teach you about college. This is regalia," and he curls his hair and he goes the whole thing. And then he acts like he's lost his train of thought, but he just stops in the middle of it. He says, "The dramatic." And he waited a painfully long amount of time. I can't even do it without losing my nerve. Pause, and then he would give you the rest of his thing. But Peter would be on the piano making sound effects and things like that. But and I thought, that must be the most awesome, hilarious place to go to college, Maranatha, and I was right. It was. Lived up to it.
Yeah, he was such a joy. I had his daughter in the same grade as me in the academy, and just a great family.
Yeah. Luke was a great basketball player here at Maranatha. Looking forward to seeing him, I hope, tomorrow. And so reliving the glory days, right?
Yes.
But isn't it amazing how God brings people into your life that just are so important and formative, and that teach you just a little something about the faith, about who God is, about who he could be for you, and then brick by brick builds that structure of your character and who you become as a result of who they have been, for you as a mentor, as a coach. And so it's bittersweet for us to say goodbye for now, but
yes,
I'm having a good time just even imagining Coach having a good time right now in glory with all the saints and reunited with some of the characters that he's
with his heavenly regalia.
Oh my goodness, he's clothed in immortality. Amazing. That's awesome. So Jonathan's got a big question for you to start things off here with the formal element.
Yeah, all right. So we ask everyone on the podcast, what's your personal mission statement?
Personal mission statement. Listening to other podcasts, I'm like, okay, I'm in good company. There are those who have it on vinyl on their wall in their home. They figured it out right after college. Mm-hmm. When I came home from Iraq, I saw that, and I'm like, boy, I want to do that. And I talked to the person who did it. He goes, well, let me show you what the process is. It was like a 2-month process to get down to this one sentence. And I'm like, this is too much work. It can't be that hard. So I just kind of scrapped it. And, we know scripturally we are created doxologically to bring glory to our Creator. And the way I would put it in the words is, my mission is to glorify God in the task and that he has called me to do right now. And it seems very simple, And and for me, that is summed up in the idea of faithfulness. For many, in my younger years, my mission would be tied to what I wanted to do to bring glory to God, not where he has placed me. And usually what I wanted to do was a comparison with someone else. I really wanted to do what they are doing. Like, God, yeah, I can glorify you in what I'm doing now, but I really want to glorify you in doing that person's, what that person is doing. And so it was quite a journey, even into my 30s, of God just humbling me to say, no, be faithful, what I've called you to do as a husband, as a father, as a deacon, as an assistant pastor, as someone working in the secular defense world that I was working in.
Well, I want to definitely trace through some of that journey of how that unfolded. But it does seem to me that you're using the word faithfulness, but it's also got elements here of patience and contentment, which sort of imply that it's not always going to meet your expectations, right? Both of those things are required when life isn't meeting certain expectations of how it should be. Even a sense of this is how it should be. This is my roadmap. And I think we've heard that theme over and over again with our guests, is that I want to do this big picture thing of glorifying God, but what does it look like for me? And you even mentioned just now, not someone else's calling, but my unique. So how do you go from that big picture of I want to glorify God with my life and I want to be faithful, but now there's an implication, life isn't going the way that I thought, or the preconceived ideas that I had. And so how do I then do that for me, my calling, and sort of determine that along the road, right?
Yeah. And we have a statement that we use in our home that I learned from my professor in seminary, stinking thinking. And so much in our minds, we can crowd it with stinking thinking. That's not biblical thinking. And there is pressure, I would say, even when I was in college, not just now in our culture, that to be successful means you have to be at the top. You have to have the followers. You have to have the term influencer in front of you to describe you. But yeah, when I look at the church, from the beginning of the church, there are so many unsung heroes, we will never know their names until glory. And yet, even in the Christian world, there's this trap to pastor the big church, to be the speaker in conferences. And for me, it was just, it was a hard road to learn because, as you mentioned, faithfulness implies patience and contentment. I know I need to be faithful, but the patience and contentment thing was the part lacking for many years in my ministry. And so when you're not patient, and you're not content, you start to do things in your own strength. And many things I did in my ministry, it was like shoehorning it to make it work, to make it successful. And then in the process, when it was falling flat on its face, I would compare, well, that person's shoehorning and it's
working for them.
They're growing for them. And it really wasn't. What I was seeing was the fruit of their patience and trusting in God. But to me, it was, I kept visualizing in my mind, they were doing it in their strength. And there's just that patience part was a hard and long lesson for me to learn.
We do tend to project our own behind-the-scenes thinking onto the motivations of others that we see in front of the scenes.
Yes.
And that's exacerbated with social media, I think, with an era where people are very much creating personas of themselves and very carefully curating public images. And we can't see behind the scenes how much work goes into that, how much patience, what their true spiritual life is like, what their real motivations are like. And so we tend to guess what they might be like behind the scenes. And then I've noticed we tend to project, which is our guesses usually are in line with how we think and how we would do in those certain situations. And so we can kind of reverse engineer their success, but trying to do it with our own thinking. And that's ironic because the whole point of the exercise is try to learn not to try to just recreate or do what the way I already think or the way I already was planning to do it. So I think that I see that in what you're saying is I'm looking at someone else's success, and is there something wrong with that? I don't think it's wrong to learn from other people's example. Maybe some motivations there are an issue, but we do want to learn successful ministry ideas. We have a conference coming up, Leader to Leader, where the whole point is leaders to train and teach other leaders about things that they've done. But we do have to kind of avoid projecting our own motivations, good or bad, on other people and reverse engineering what they're doing.
As you know, there was a time after I graduated seminary where I was the assistant to our own Dr. Rock here at Maranatha when he was church planting. And when I left there and went to go plant my own church in Northern California, there have been many calls to Dr. Brock. It's like, now I understood why you did what you did. Like seeing it through the perspective that he had, it really corrected a lot of thinking that I had when I was his assistant.
Well, let's talk through kind of your journey. All right. So you've told us a little bit about the beginning, a little bit about we know where you are now. But you said you were unsaved when you came to the academy.
Yes.
So as you look back, what do you point to as really the point that God got a hold of your life and convert you? You say that's really when I was personally saved.
Yes, it would be my senior year. So almost a year after I came into the academy 2 weeks before my junior year of high school started.
Did you think you were okay? Did you think of yourself as a Christian?
I did. I grew up in a Christian home. I could tell you the gospel. But as I look back, I even had early professions. I mean, but it was so full of confusion. It was very much of a manipulated repeat after me prayer. I remember VBS. I got saved every day that week as a 6-year-old. And it was by the same counselor, which I wish I knew who it was because I want to shake him. What were you thinking?
Yeah.
But it wasn't until I came here, removing me from a secular environment of the public school I was in and putting me here, I was a fish out of water. Yeah. And first of all, being around friends who conversations were different and you could let your guard down and there was no facade or something you had to live up to or portray. And being around those type of friends and then just having godly people who cared about you, like genuinely like Coach Akins, like Coach Price. And at that time, it was Mr. Sturgill was my professor. I mean, he helped me with a lot of those questions on salvation. But it wasn't until Coach Price, the college football coach, preached in our high school chapel, and it was a gospel message. And that was the first time I recognized I am lost. And yet I did nothing about it for a year. Wow. And I was reading books at that time. I don't know if you remember those Frank Peretti books. They were Christian fiction books where
Piercing the Darkness, or
in this present darkness and piercing. Yeah. And he had a description of demons. They had these certain type of eyes, yellow eyes, and their breath smelled like sulfur. And I remember at night laying in bed for a year, every night in tears, convinced I could smell sulfur in my room, knowing that I was doomed to hell if I was to die that night. And I did nothing about it. Like, how do I tell this to my parents?
Was it just that issue in your mind? The battle was over just the pride factor of what will I say or what will people think, or what was mostly holding you back?
Confusion. Like why do I think like this? Because I remembered, which were false conversions. I remember those moments. My experience was not matching my assessment of my soul. And
so you were trying to convince yourself that these doubts weren't real.
Yeah, all is good.
You were good.
And that's when one day I just walked into Dr. Sturgill's office, the principal. I says, I need help.
Yeah.
And he just took me to some clear scripture. I had it. I can't find it now. Up until a couple years ago, a Post-it note where he wrote down verses for me to just interact with. It was out of Romans 10. And Romans 10, 9 and 10. But if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God hath raised him from the dead, you will be saved. That confession and belief is what I finally I nailed down. And like, I have not done this. and it was a Sunday night in church. Pastor Lincoln gave an invitation like he always does. I don't remember what he was preaching. Had nothing to do with where I was at spiritually. And I just like, Tim, you are stupid. You need to deal with this. And I went forward to Pastor Lincoln, and he grabbed my dad, and my dad led me to the Lord. And that is my true conversion. That is where I saw fruit, a change. And at that time, it was November of my senior year. I enlisted in the active duty Army right after I graduated high school.
What year would that have been?
95, May of 95.
So Desert Shield and all
that had all passed.
Yeah, but it's kind of over with.
I never went to the active Army, though.
You enlisted, but it didn't happen.
I enlisted, and I was waiting for my ship-out date, which was October of 95. But the last day of college registration here, all my friends that I was in high school with were starting college. Many of my friends that I knew from Michigan were here and students. And I'm like, I need to go to college. And I backed out of my enlistment and registered, like literally the last day. I skipped all the orientation. And
that it does explain a lot. I was your RA, and I was a senior that year. I don't actually remember. You must have been okay.
So it's karma that you're back and now having to deal with those.
I just flew under the radar. It doesn't mean I behaved. It just means that you didn't catch me.
Listen, what is it with the vice president for advancement being like that? Because Jim had the exact same story. Didn't enroll until the end of the summer.
And now they're here to atone for all
that. Yeah.
Because those are the type of students that will drive you nuts now in your job. So you decided to not go the active duty route at the last second, decided to enroll in college. What was your initial major then?
I didn't know what to do. And when I applied, they asked, what do you want to major? I'm like, well, my friend Brian's a biblical studies major. I'll do that. That's what I did. I mean, my whole life was about, up until that point, was serving in the Army. My dad was in the Army for 33 years. I could tell you everything. I would read Army manuals for fun. My son always wants to get a hold of them. I still have a stack of them that are packed away. I'm like, nah, you don't need to see those. But it really became an idol to me. Like the idea of dying for my country was something to pursue.
You thought that sounded glorious. Yeah. Wow. And so you just decided to be a biblical studies major,
and then in the midst of all that,
wow,
I get saved. I come to know the Lord truly. But it was my senior year, and so I still had these plans of enlisting. It was all worked out. My enlistment had me joining my brothers in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in the airborne, jumping out of airplanes with them. And
so your specialty was going to be infantry and airborne and front lines.
I wanted to eat bugs and live in the forest.
Okay, well, your life took a little different turn. I don't know if you still eat bugs, but you end up here. You're a freshman my senior year, and we were in the same dorm, same floor, and so you had the world's greatest RA, obviously.
Absolutely.
To start. It was only downhill from there. I don't know who you had afterwards, probably just bums, but you. Is that what it stays with, biblical studies? I mean, is there a point where you feel like there was a calling that was beyond just I'm doing this because everybody else is doing it? There had to have been some point where it became personal.
And that was confusion for me, and in the sense that I'm meeting these guys in the dorm who are in ministry, want to pursue ministry, and they've got these great illustrious callings to ministry. Like, as in my mind, like the clouds parted and they saw it written in the sky.
Yeah.
Go be my preacher.
Right. Well, that's what I'm getting at, because I do think there's this romanticization of calling.
I never had that. And that was confusion for me, because here I am, a biblical studies major, but I'm a new believer, true new believer. There was discipleship that needed in my life, and it wasn't necessarily happening because everyone just assumed, hey, he's a biblical studies major. He's on track with everyone else. And it really was the first time I was challenged in my thinking was with Dr. John Pratt, who was here at Maranatha a short time. And he challenged me to think scripturally, like, because I would say something stupid in class, which I did a lot. And he could have just blasted me, and he never did. He just took me to scripture and like, matched with what you're saying with Scripture. And when I was security, I would do rounds late at night, and he would be in his office working on his dissertation, and he would stop and talk to me and ask me those hard questions. It was the time he spent with me out of the classroom, asking me and allowing me to ask dumb questions.
Yeah.
But my calling there was a consistent growing 1 Timothy 3:1 desire, a passion for shepherding, for pastoring, for ministry. That it was not a moment walking down the aisle, a camp service meeting. It was this growing passion that grew.
Yeah. So what'd you do in the summers and for ministry or anything like that to try and start to?
The first summer I did counseling at Ironwood out in California. That again, when we're talking about Coach Akins, just God putting men in front of us, and everywhere I went, God has put men in front of me, and I've been I would like to think that I've done a good job in recognizing safety in a multitude of counselors, but latching onto those men that you see doing it right biblically.
Sure.
And so Ironwood, Walt Brock and his son Sam Brock invested in me greatly. Mm-hmm. And then I also did neighborhood Bible time for a summer with Brother Homesher, the
lots
founder.
Lots of preaching practice there.
Lots of preaching practice and lots of, again, what's amazing about neighborhood Bible time is that there's enough pastors out there willing to let some young knuckleheads like me come in and
that is
preach
a bit of
to
a
their
miracle.
Yes.
Yeah. And so you did that for a summer, and then you graduate, and then what's step one after college?
Well, graduation. I graduated college. I'm like, all right, I need to go find a ministry. And I have ministry opportunities being put in front of me. I'm submitting resumes. I'm talking to pastors. I'm a newlywed, just married a month after college.
Where did you meet your wife?
I met my wife at her home church in Taylorville, Illinois, Grace Baptist Church. It was a matchmaking endeavor by my brother and his wife who were there. And I needed all the help I can get. So matchmaking.
Well, you said it. All right. And
as my wife would say, she goes, I'm glad we went to different colleges because I probably would not want to date you if we went to the same college.
I have said the same thing to my wife. Like, you would not have given me the time of day in college. I had fun in college, as you know. But she was looking for a serious person. And that was me a little later in life, but not at that time. So we both benefited from not marrying Maranatha girls, unfortunately, in one way, but fortunately for us. And so that we have that in common as well. And so Mandy you guys got married that summer or what?
Yes,
okay.
We both graduated, and then a month and a half later was our wedding. And my intent was that summer we were going to churches, like we were at just weird things were happening in these visits. Like we went to one church in Maryland. He's like, Tim, I want you guys here. I got to have a business meeting, and I'll call you like in a week or two. Never heard from him. I'm like, okay.
Whoa.
Went to another place, my other brother's church down in Georgia. The pastor's like, I want you to start looking at housing. I want you here. And then we get back here to Watertown. 2 days later, he calls, I just don't have a piece.
Oh, no.
Like, okay. It was a
hard
roller
to deal with. It's so unspecific.
Yeah. And he,
wow.
and I pressed him, like, so what don't you have a piece about? Well, you just don't have a lot of experience in the pulpit. I'm like, yes, I'm a college graduate. Yeah. That is correct.
I just did neighborhood Bible time. That's
yeah.
a lot of preaching. Oh, wow.
And
yeah.
And so it was just those type of things. And then
okay,
finally,
when you got that rejection,
yeah,
two very different ways of that coming about, how did you deal with that? Because did you have the maturity to see it as the Lord closing the door and just move on, or was it kind of devastating, or how did you process that?
The Georgia one, which I think would have been the first one I'd interact with, was kind of, it took us by, because it just seemed like a done deal.
Yeah.
The deacons, when we were there, were like, we want you here. It's my brother's church, the brother I was probably closest to at the time. This just seemed perfect. In our eyes, humanly speaking, seemed perfect. But in hindsight and seeing what happened later in that ministry, it was God protecting me.
And that teaches us that God's viewpoint on our lives and how they're unfolding is better than our viewpoint in a linear, directional fashion. And he knows the end from the beginning, and we can trust him. And I think at formative points in life, we're tested in that. And then in later points, we can look back and see, oh, that's what he was doing. But you didn't know that at the time. It looked perfect to you.
Yes.
And so it kind of teaches us that just because it looks perfect to us doesn't mean that it's what God really has for us. And so don't get too attached to just thinking one thing. It may be that God's using that good desire in your heart to get you some preparation, to teach you some things about life and ministry that you need to know. And then maybe there's actually a different direction, and you have to be careful about latching on too hard to one specific vision of the future that might not be God's specific plan for you, at least maybe not forever, right? Because your career's taken some real turns.
It has, and that was, as a younger man, that was a challenge, because in the ideal, even when you're in college, there is this is the way it's supposed to look.
Sure.
Like, get your training, go into ministry. And I was trying to get into ministry, and there was just kept being clear doors being closed, weird ones. And so at the end of that summer, after graduating, having 3 or 4 churches I interacted with, I just decided, we're 2 weeks out from the school starting here. I'm like, Mandy, I'm just going to go and take some grad classes here. And literally after we made that decision, I get a call from that pastor in Maryland who never called back. And I was like, thank you, pastor, but we've decided just to stay here. And that was hard, because like, okay, because also I was recognizing some things in talking to these churches, that I'm not settled where I am.
They were asking you questions.
Like
that you were,
ministry, philosophical
okay, yeah.
questions. You know, I'm not settled what type of church that I would fit into. And so I recognized, so undergraduate for me was get it done.
Right.
I wouldn't say I'm preparing for ministry. It was knock out Greek, and get the assignments done, get that degree. And it really wasn't until grad school where I started, okay, wow, I need to prepare for ministry. And I always tell people I'm a late bloomer when it comes to figuring things out. I'm a little slow at times, at least in my younger years. And that's part of the reason you say my career has done this. I think that's part of the reason is the Lord has had to do some unique things that way to get my attention.
Do you think those initial interactions and frustrated plans taught you some things that helped you later? Did you learn some lessons through that gave you a little bit more of an understanding of how to approach that same task or that same question later on in life?
Oh, yes. When one of the reasons I didn't want to do grad school right away, because I was told grad school ruins preachers.
Oh, really?
Not from, I didn't hear that from Maranatha, but from pastors. I would, you go to seminary, your heart turns into a cemetery. That was a statement I had heard. And
Interesting.
But again, I come back to God has always put men in front of me, individuals in front of me, who just put their arm around me when I didn't even know I needed an arm put around me. Like, they looked for guys like me. And at my junior and senior year, there was 3 professors who kind of came in, Dr. Mays, Dr. Myers, and Mr. Hockman. And those guys went after me, and in ways that I had never had someone come after me before. And it was really, they all went to the same seminary at Calvary and Lansdale, and I'm like, okay, that's where I got to go. If this is what they're producing, I want to be those men, and where they had a heart of looking for guys like me and helping us get to where we need to be in ministry, discipling us.
So at that time, there wouldn't have been a lot of distance type education. So did you have to move there, or did you
We would have to move there. So
yeah.
I enrolled in grad school, and then about 2-3 weeks into it, I told my wife I'm coming home. Remember, we're newlyweds for like 3 months at this point. I was like, I did not want to come home, read hundreds of pages, and write papers. I wanted to come home and be married and be with my wife. So I dropped out of grad school. And that first year, she worked at Exonia Bank, and I worked at a place called the Custom Shop, building cabinetry out behind Walmart, and we were just married and heavily involved in the junior high ministry at Calvary with Pastor Ray Kobita. And then the second year comes around. Now Maranatha is starting this new thing called the GA program. And so myself and Caleb Stein were the first GAs of the program we have now.
Okay.
And so he worked in the library, and I worked for Coach Price in the athletic office. And I did that for a semester and a half, and then I was deployed to Iraq with the National Guard. So
Okay, so at some point you linked up with the Army after all.
after my freshman year in college, when I realized, how am I going to pay for this?
Okay.
My dad says, why don't you do this option? He goes, it tickles your Army itch, and if it keeps you on task. What I didn't know is Pastor Lincoln, our pastor, told my dad, he's like, Jerry, we just got to get Tim through his sophomore year of college and he'll stick it out. Like, that was, I don't know if that was wisdom from just being a pastor in a college town, but he's like, if we can get him through his sophomore year, he'll finish. And so my dad was just trying to figure out all the ways, because that first year, my dad was so excited that I backed out of my enlistment. Now, my dad's an Army guy, but he never wanted his boys to enlist. He was so excited. He's like, I'll pay your school bill. But my freshman year, I was there, but I had no clue what I was doing. I flunked freshman orientation when it was a class. How do you do that, right? Well, it was my only morning class. I'm not getting up at 7 a.m. Well,
how'd that go in the Army?
some of that was remedied.
Yes, I'm sure.
I like that clean phrase. It was remedied.
Yeah. So after my freshman year, my dad says, all right, you had your chance. You blew it. I'm not paying for you to have fun in the dorms. And I had to find my own way through school.
So you said, going back to your narrative, you said you were deployed after a year and a half in the GA program. And you guys have any kids at this point yet?
No, we were married for a year and a half.
Yeah.
And, I left, and I was gone for over a year. And my wife, I left it in her hands. You could go home to live with your parents. Makes sense. We save a lot of money, or stay here. And my mom, who is someone she is unique as a mother-in-law in that she keeps her opinion to herself. But
I'm not going to touch that.
Yeah. and that may not come out right, but my mom is someone who will not give her opinion or counsel unless it's asked for.
Okay.
But this is the one time in our marriage she gave my wife unsolicited advice. And my mom married right out of high school to a guy who just enlisted in the Army, and they were going to Germany. And in the early 60s, your first sergeant's wife, they were all World War II vets. And this World War II wife, her first sergeant's wife, would tell the ladies, it is important for our men to have a home to come back to when they go out in the field. So it was what she was saying is, yeah, you got all of Europe to go see, but be home when your man comes home. It's important that they have a home to come back to. And my wife took that seriously, and we had our little Fox Creek apartment over by the high school, and and she maintained it. And Calvary, there was 3 of us who deployed that remembers at Calvary at the time: Peter Wright and Tyrone Lyles and myself. And
wait, who?
Tyrone Lyles.
The first Peter Wright?
I'm not Peter Wright.
Not
Peter Reed. Sorry.
Peter Reed.
Sorry.
Yeah, there you go.
Different Peter. Not Peter Wright.
That's a part of his story I missed.
I know. Like, we got to get him in here.
Yeah,
And,
Peter Reed. Yeah.
And Calvary really treated our wives like a widow's ministry, like the husband was absent, and they really cared. Some of my wife has very sweet memories of Calvary that I'm not a part of. So some of the young marrieds, she has close relationships that I met them when I came back. But the young marriage class just cared for my wife. And
wow. So you learned at that point, as a couple, the value of community within a local church, that God's designed that to help supplement and provide for basic needs.
That event set the course for decisions we made about our family in the local church, and the primacy of the local church in our family's life. Whether I was pastoring or not pastoring, the local church will be primary in our home.
And then I guess you survived your deployment.
Yes, I did.
Okay, good. Spoiler alert,
yeah.
I guess.
So I left being married for a year and a half, came back married for 3 years.
Yeah. And at that point, now it's time to get serious. Did you finish up your seminary?
I did not finish my GA. I
GA?
left and went right to seminary. It was time to grow up and leave Watertown.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it does. I've seen that, and I think I love it when our graduates stick around a couple of years, and it's usually it's fun to see them stick around. You did this a little bit. There's a gradual maturing process as all your friends leave.
Oh yeah.
You've
It's like
talked about
mourning for like 2 years.
It is.
Because
Yeah.
they all get the bug, and God opens up the door for them to have ministries elsewhere. And there's a really important spot right after college that I think the mentors that are that you have in college, they take on a completely new mentorship form when you're newly married and you're in ministry for the first time, whether it's in a GA spot or it's in a part-time role or whatever it is. Because then instead of in an academic mentorship way, now it's in life advice.
Yeah.
How to gauge those opportunities. Will that ministry fit you? Will that opportunity actually pan out the way you think it's going to? And then when they go, those of us who are stuck around go, oh, I'm so happy for them. Yeah, and then we make friends, and my wife and I have had to make friends with people who are either long-term Maranatha people or in people in the community, and that's something where, again, like you said, the primacy of the local church, you can't just have Maranatha friends. You got to have your church friends too.
Yeah, it transitions from student, and I'm a student watch care member, or I'm a temporary here for a while guy, to I don't know how long any of us will be here, but while we're here, we need to think of ourselves as
being here,
fully here,
right,
and present, and being the person in front of some others, and start to transition from being served as a student to serving others.
Right.
And that is the transition of Christian college from one thing to the next. And so I love that, but I do perfectly understand the feeling that, okay, I've been preparing, it's now time to start doing. And I guess at that point, is that when you linked up with Brian and headed out to California, or was there something in between?
Well, I had seminary, but to go back to the point you mentioned, it's like mourning when you're friends and you're still here. I crammed a 4-year degree into 6 years, and so I definitely, by my last year, you just became that weird older guy who's still hanging out on campus, right? You just want to get done, and and again, I remember Dr. Myers saying, "Tim, why are you still here?" Like, I was graduated, and it was pushing me out of the nest, and I felt that, like, those men who I mentioned earlier were now moving on to the next round of discipleship, and what I love was Mr. Hockman. I mean, he loved me in my immaturity, and Manny and I, him and his wife just invested.
Yeah.
We were in their home. And they were like, "Tim, you need to get to seminary. You need to get out of here." And they did a lot to push me towards seminary. So I go to seminary, and Dr. Brock, Brian, we were best friends since high school. He's one of the first people who kind of befriended me when I came here. And we've just always had a close friendship. In my mind, I would have, I want to serve with my friend Brian wherever he goes. I just love being with my friend Brian. And part of it was, I talked about earlier, trying to shoehorn into, we're going to make a ministry for us. I remember in college, we came up with this idea of tag team preaching our freshman year, because we watched the Corley twins were visiting. They're missionaries out in Arizona.
In an actual message, not like you do the morning, I'll do the evening.
So the Corley twins were missionaries to the Navajo, and they were here for missions conference. They're identical twins, and they would do this preaching thing, and they would switch in the middle of the sermon. And I remember Brian and I, we can do that.
You're not twins.
And I remember Mrs. Brock saying, "Boys, no, you can't. It's not the same." And her graciousness, she's like, it never went anywhere. But
I'm glad.
But as we talk about impatience and not being patient while being faithful, I was impatient in seminary. I'm starting seminary, and I'm watching some of my friends that I went to college with finishing seminary. It's like, man, I'm stuck here. And then, so I'm going to do this MDiv in 3 years. and I had it all worked out. But then the Lord changed plans. Mandy became pregnant, and I'm like, okay, how am I going to provide? Now I'm panicking, and instead of being patient and being faithful, I went and found a ministry an hour away to be at my first youth pastorate in New Jersey. And by the way, the pastor of that church just defended his D-Men project yesterday. So I was the youth pastor at that church. Yes.
Wow, cool.
And I was just pushing and trying to move faster than God wanted to. And as I did, the more I did this, the more we got into financial struggle. I can't pay for school. I can't. And now when you're pastoring, there's no 3-year MDiv schedule. And
Right.
And that was a real learning experience. Wonderful pastor that I worked with there, very patient with me. But then by the time I was done, that impatience had caught up, and I was just discouraged. I was ready to just quit everything, and I'm just going to go back in the Army. I had talked to a recruiter. I'd gotten the paperwork. Mandy and I are filling it out. And then one day as I'm filling it out, more of the paperwork, I'm watching my son, Titan, just start learning the crawl, and he's crawling. And I'm like, if I do this, I'm going to miss birthdays. I'm going to miss Christmases. And that's part of the reason also I didn't consider chaplaincy, because for me, chaplaincy is not the office of a pastor. But for me, the qualifications of 1 Timothy 3, how can I manage my home if I'm not there? And that was like, I just can't do it. And so that kind of put to bed the military permanently for us. But now I got to figure out, I was struggling and not knowing, okay, I'm plucking away at classes now. And then we took our teens to the wilds, and I met up with Pastor Andy Counterman. We followed their group down there. And I just spent some time with him, and he just loved me in very unique ways. And he just says, Tim, I can't promise you anything. We do have an internship. Why don't you just come to Anchor and use us as a watering hole? And that was one of the best decisions we ever made, because one of the things that by watching Pastor Counterman and his wife minister in the local church setting, I'm like, ministry is fun.
Yeah.
Ministry is awesome. I don't want to do anything else. And they, even now, I mean, where they're at now, they're in the teen ministry. I mean, they're grandparents, and they just invest in people.
Yeah, and Pastor Counterman's on our board of trustees, and sometimes colleges' board of trustees are these like mysterious old people that, say no to everything, and they're like the no fun group or something. That's not Maranatha's board of trustees.
No, it's not at all.
We have guys that are absolutely invested in, why does he continue to serve on Maranatha's board when he could be doing, less travel, settle down, enjoy his grandkids and family. And he does those things. But he's taken on new ministry. He's traveling the country, talking about missions and trying to get churches fired up about that. He serves on the board of trustees at Maranatha because he wants to invest in young people and inspire another generation to pick up the torch and carry it ahead. And he's always had that kind of vision for how can we do more? How can we be creative? Who's out there that needs to be encouraged? And I mean, you're kind of a success story of how
we are. Yeah. And there's a lot of seminary guys from Calvary that went through his internship that he has mentored in that way. And so in the process, I was just there for 1 year. I switched from an MDiv to an MA to finish. And my friendship with Brian, we were always talking on the phone and interacting. So I said, hey, what do you think about me coming out and helping? And he's let me think about it, and we had more conversations, and this is what he says: Tim, I'd love to have you out here. I have nothing to offer you except the title office of pastor. So, and that was a step of faith for us. We had no job. We moved out there, and when I got there, we found out, hey, the church was going to give us like $300 a month. And
in California, that goes a long ways.
And I remember we getting there. We had debt from schooling and trying to live out east. In those next 3 months after moving there, my friendship with Brian turned from friendship to this is my pastor. Much, I would say, of what I've learned about the office of shepherding was from Brian Brock and his wife. That's what Mandy and I really grew in understanding the role of pastoring and the role of how your family can be a part of that shepherding ministry. And so we were there for 10 years with them, and it had its ups and downs, and but you were
bivocational at that time.
Bivocational, and
seeing success on the secular side, even though that wasn't your academic preparation, it was just something that obviously fit your design, your disposition, and you're seeing success there. And also working with, Brian, you guys are seeing success, I guess you'd call it, in the ministry side of things, as well as the church is established and growing. But I mean, at some point you're led to move another direction. I don't want to say walk away. I don't think that's the right term, but you're like, okay, I need to launch out and do this on my own. Leave the nest again. Basically.
Yeah. So there was, at one point, we met with Brian. My wife and I we took Brian and Rebecca to a meal. I had this job opportunity. Again, it felt like everything I was doing on the secular side was turning to gold, if you could use that expression. But on the ministry side, it felt like, man, I'm just running into walls. But again, I'm still ministering with like, okay, I got to be like Brian instead of working within the gifts that God's given me. And the company offered me an opportunity, a great opportunity. Tim, we would like you to go head up. We're trying to win a defense contract in England with the Ministry of Defense. We want you to head up that contract. Would you be willing to move to England with your family? Wow. Okay. And I'm like, this is a great opportunity. Oh, wait. I got this pastor thing. And it was like, okay, when I had that thought, I'm like, okay, I got to deal with this calling. Is this what God wants me doing right now? Because it felt like pastoring felt like an anchor holding me back, as opposed to this is what I get to do as shepherd, be bivocational. And I decided I stepped down at that point, transitioned to a deacon at Life Point, and pursued just the secular job that I was doing, executive management. And they never got the contract. We never went to England, which we praise the Lord for. And then the government came calling, kind of headhunting me to leave the contractor side. So I did that for a little bit. And I've just realized to work at that level in the government, it was like, I felt like I had to sell my soul to the government. Because everything I knew of executive management kind of goes out the door, and you've just got a lot of red tape and bureaucracy, unions, and it was a horrible time. And then when I left the contractor, the CEO came out to try to keep me, and he goes, Tim, I think you're going to struggle on the government side.
He sort of knew that wasn't going to be the...
Yeah. And part is, as our company is all made up of veterans don't think differently from the rest of the government, civil service. And he goes, just want you to know, if at any point you're like, you don't want to do this, we'll have a job for you, and we'll make one up if we don't have it. And I'm like, great, that's a nice fallback. And that's what I ended up doing. But in the process of that, the Lord, that passion for shepherding, because it was never either or. Secular management in the local church. It was the local church is always primary in our home and in our family. That's just, my wife and I have never wavered on that. And so that passion to serve was coming back. And I remember talking to Brian, and I asked him, I go, Brian, what do you need to see in me to say, yeah, Tim needs to be pastoring? And I'll never forget his answer. I'm expecting some great long list. Or he goes, it's simple, Tim. I would love to see you and Mandy love people. And when I was his assistant, it was all about the system and administration and the management of people. They zigged when they knew they were supposed to zag, and I would, like, the details. I would lose the sight of people in order to keep the details straight. And what happens is, when you're all about process, it can run over people. Just like if you ignore process, it runs over people.
I was going to say, the process isn't there to serve itself. It's there to serve the overall mission that you have, and to support the respect for people and a diverse, system. And
Yeah.
so it does take a balance. But if you just all process and no heart, then that's not not going to work in ministry. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when he said that to me, I'm like, oh, he's right. Like, this has been the same conversation him and I have had many times. And so I asked him, how do we do this? How do I do that? He goes, well, I don't think it's going to be by putting you in overseeing some ministry. He goes, I would like for you and Mandy just to find a couple or two that no one knows but you and I what you're trying to accomplish, and just go after them at a discipleship level. And I remember asking him, who? He's like, well, I think we need to start praying about that. And we met and we would pray. And then the Lord, through some unique circumstances at our church, provided great ministry opportunities with a handful of couples that we got to lead. One couple to the Lord. The mom just showed up at Awana. My wife just asked a question: if you were to die tonight, do you know if you'd go to heaven? She goes, I don't know. And she goes, that's why I'm here. My son asked me a question about God and I didn't have the answer, and I need to get the answer. So she showed up on a Wednesday night with her son.
Wow. And
Mandy led her to the Lord. I got to lead her husband to the Lord a couple weeks later, and they are serving faithfully there now. We've just had a handful where God was answering that prayer to give us opportunities to love people. And there's a couple prayers I've learned in my Christian walk that God doesn't wait long to answer. One, search me, O God, and know my heart, and see if there's any wicked way in me.
That's a dangerous prayer, but a necessary.
But God never makes me wait to get the answer to that prayer.
Yeah.
That's the prayer I pray when we're told to. Paul tells us to examine ourselves before the Lord's Supper. And then the other one, Lord, give me someone to love and to minister to, or give me someone to share the gospel with. I mean, it's really instantaneous, at least in my life. It has.
Well, certainly when we pray in God's will, we expect and are promised an answer. And those two prayers are clear in Scripture, things that we are told to pray for. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, that's praying in God's will, and of course he's going to answer that. And yet, isn't it ironic that we don't do it more? And it's an indictment, isn't it? That we should pray that deliberately every day. Lord, who is it today that I need to be serving? That's real leadership, is finding and recognizing others that need to be served in some way, whether it's with the gospel or just with the compassion of seeing and meeting a need. Yeah.
Yeah, and once the Lord started answering those prayers and putting people in front of us, LifePoint the church has some transitions. Dr. Brock came back here.
Yep.
And the new pastor came in, and I shared with him, this is what the homework Brian gave me, and he and
you were like, I don't know if the other guy told you, but
that's kind of what it was. That's what the conversation was.
Plan here.
That's what. In fairness to Pastor Kett, he's like, well, I understand. I just don't know you, Tim. And it's like, what do I do? And I remember talking to Dr. John Brock, Brian's dad, who had just retired out there, my situation. He goes, well, why don't you reach out to my brother, Walt Brock at Ironwood? Maybe they know of some churches. And that began a relationship where they were starting a new internship program meant for younger guys out of college.
Right.
And they go, well, why don't you come and be the one the first year, and you help us put it together. So I worked with Pastor David Brock. What a fun year him and I had of ministry together. Yeah. And was ordained right at the end of that. And then we went up north to do the replant of Proclaim Baptist Church.
And time would fail us to go from there to here, which involves an interesting family twist on the puzzle, which we already talked a little bit in the backstage portion about my buddies that you have adopted into the McPhillips family in a miraculous and unbelievable way. And that too has been God's blessing along the way. But I guess is there some way that you would kind of summarize all that now? I know you're not retired and you're not at the end of the road yet, but at this point in
those
the
girls
road,
make me feel like it sometimes.
Yeah, well, we're about the same age, and I can't even fathom having a 3-year-old. But how would you sum it up, God, your faithfulness in ministry is one thing, but God's faithfulness is on a whole different level. And I wonder how you would maybe summarize all that and kind of bring it into a concluding thought.
God's long-suffering kindness and patience with me makes me love him more and more every day. The fact that he would choose me for service, choose me to be Mandy's wife, choose me to be the biological dad of Titan and Claire.
To choose you to be what?
I'm sorry, not Mandy's. Mandy's husband, not like
you were in such a profound thought right there. I mean, I can't let that go.
He would choose me to be the biological father of Titan and Claire and the adopted father of Bonnie, Eleanor, and Noel. It's just beyond comprehension. And I remember listening to a message once on Romans 9, and the preacher was saying, the amazing thing is not that God hated Esau. The amazing, incredible thing is that God loved Jacob. Like, there's nothing lovable about me. God's long-suffering mercy and kindness to me that we see, great is thy faithfulness, your mercy is new every morning. That is where I live. But what's amazing about those verses is the verse before it. Because Jeremiah, the book is Lamentations. It's a whole book on lamenting. Is right before it, as he is struggling to comprehend what God is doing to the nation, particularly Jerusalem. He says, but this I call to mind, I have hope. And my wife and I have learned in the last several years, we are going to live in that world of hope. And I would say in the last few years that I was pastoring, there was the weight and burden on me of how broken our world is. I could spend hours with you talking about the craziness of ministry and just the brokenness and the wickedness of people, not lost people, but the evils of our flesh that we battle as believers that has shown itself in church life. And there is a weight that pastoral leadership carries because a lot of it is confidential. It's just, there is a weight and burden that you carry, and the dependency that my wife and I live on, and the simple statement that Jeremiah says, I have hope. And it is out of that hope that he says, great is thy faithfulness. Your mercies are new every morning.
Well, we really appreciate your time here today, kind of opening up the conversation for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with you. I'm definitely excited that you're back here on campus to be my boss. You've got great wisdom to impart, and we look forward to see how God uses you in the future.
Thank you. I'm glad I could be down here.
Amen.
Thank you for joining us today. On Mission is a production of Maranatha Baptist University. Subscribe to On Mission on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Don't forget to leave a review, as this will help other growing leaders find these conversations. For information about our guests, previous episodes, and general information about On Mission or MBU, go to mbu.edu/podcast. Join us again next week as we examine